Do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Welcome, fellow traveler. I see you've come seeking some novice advice. Well, you've come to the right place. My name is Liam McKinnon. I am a professional dungeon master in the city of Edmonton, Alberta. I'm also the founder of Novice DMing, and I'm an actor and professional improviser with Sorry Not Sorry Improv. And today we are going to be giving you advice on how to handle player character death. Yay! God. Wow. First in the entire video series that we're talking about death. That's good. I'm gonna get rid of this. We don't need to have this right here. We're just talking. So let's talk about death, shall we? Player character death is one of those experiences that we will all go through at some point in time. If we haven't experienced it yet, you are so lucky. The rest of us, though, we're struggling and suffering. Or maybe we're not. Interesting to say that, right? For those of you who are brand new to tabletop role-playing games and are very confused as to what death of a player character even means, I'll let you know. A death of a player character, whether it be for Dungeons & Dragons or Vampire the Masquerade or any tabletop role-playing game system, or just any game in general, is when your character's health or hit point value goes to 0, when you have no hit points. Like, let's say you had 5 and then you have 0, you have 0. And then those particular games may also have a system in where you are trying to stay alive in that moment. Like for Dungeons & Dragons, it's called a death saving throw. When you reach 0 hit points and you start rolling dice to see if you will potentially survive. Sometimes you don't, and sometimes that results in death. And sometimes you will also take on a tremendous amount of damage at one point, to the point where you will face what's called instant death. That's basically what death is in tabletop role-playing games, when characters go through an adventure and a circumstance takes them below their hit point value and they just die. Another thing that could potentially happen is if the characters meet powerful beings that go well beyond their own possible ability of power. And through the choices that they make, through the interactions they have, that powerful being decides they must die. And it just happens. And the players die in that instant. For a lot of people who don't stress out about this too much, they look at it very simply, and really the best person that articulated this was Ivan Drago in Rocky IV.
If he dies, he dies.
Yeah, that's it. And for a lot of people, that's usually how it stands. When a character faces that outcome of death, they're dead, and that's it. And they present that result as if that is the answer to the question. How do you handle player character death?
If he dies, he dies.
To me, that's not a satisfying enough answer, and it hasn't been. Whenever I go through tabletop role-playing games, I don't like it personally. The reason I don't is because, for myself, at least when I run tabletop role-playing games, it's a very heavy investment of my own time, my effort, and my love. Playing tabletop role-playing games is how I express love to my friends and my family and people who I find interesting within my professional fields. Yes, I use tabletop role-playing games as a networking thing, but I don't do it with people I don't want to do it with. I involve people in my table space that I want to get to know, that I respect, that I care about, and that I love. And because of that, tabletop role-playing games have a deep level of my own personal investment, and that includes involving other people's characters in that exploration. I don't know if any of you have watched the Curse of Strahd campaign or the FSF campaign that I have right now on Novice DMing, but those campaigns are heavy investments of my time. The FSF campaign is a homebrew campaign, and Curse of Strahd was a campaign that was given to me by David Wilson, and these campaigns were tremendous projects to work on, and I love working on them, and with Strahd it has wrapped up, so I loved working on it, but it was also one where I was also facing the very real understanding that death was always present. But it was so much of my time and investment that when death occurred, I didn't want it to be the end. Let's stop talking about this just in an abstract form, and let's actually talk about what I feel is important to understand when handling death in your campaign. The first question I would ask you if you are bringing this question to me, I'm going to answer your question with a question. The first thing I'm going to ask you, have you talked to your players about the very real possibility that death could happen? For example, there's a game that I actually run in Edmonton. It is a Tomb of Annihilation community campaign. For that particular campaign, I told my players, hey, this game is one in which it is going to be like Uncharted, the video game series. It's going to be a little bit like Up, like the Pixar movie, and Dinotopia. It's going to be very adventurous. You're going to be experiencing dinosaurs and a lot of lighthearted fun moments. And then it's going to become Saw. The horror franchise Saw, it's going to become that. And that's just something we all have to accept before we go on this adventure. And if you guys are okay with this game becoming Saw at a certain point, we're going to be fine. That was something that I had posed to my players to let them know that what we were about to experience and explore was going to be heavy and that death is going to hit us. And the very particular type of death was going to hit us in a way that I couldn't really fix for them. Saw is a very unique form of horror in that it's a bunch of puzzles and traps, and also it's very severe and punishing, and it's not great to watch. Like, that kind of experience is something I wanted to let my players know about. On the flip side, when I ran Curse of Strahd, I told my players that death is very real, but it's more akin to like Hammer horror movies. I don't know if anybody has ever watched the 1950s like Hammer horror Dracula or Frankenstein, but those movies were very much an inspiration for me. They are violent and they are scary, but they're also fun, low budget, they're very personal, and death is a very interesting thing in those particular stories. I didn't want death in those games to be the same level as it was with Tomb of Annihilation, because I didn't want the feeling to be like ultimately punishing and awful. I wanted it to be something that could be like bad, but still hopeful. As an example, I have to talk about my campaign right here. I'm sorry, I don't like to just always talk about stories of my own campaigns, but this one I need to share because it's ridiculous. So, the Curse of Strahd campaign, that, again, you guys can see on the channel, started with the players at level 1 killing a Cyclops. Just doing it. And, like, this is before they even went to the lands of Barovia. It was part of a prologue, like, couple sessions that I was setting up. And they killed a Cyclops. A Cyclops is probably one of the most dangerous giants that you can probably encounter that doesn't have, like, inherent magical powers. This thing is massive, and it's towering, and it's dangerous. And through bad dice rolls on my part, and really clever ingenuity on my players' parts, they got the Cyclops to a position where they were constantly attacking it while it was prone on the ground. They were blinding this creature all the time, and they killed it. And in that moment, I was like, oh no. This was actually a moment when I experienced death in a very different way, where the death of an NPC made me question if this campaign was going to have any weight at all, because my players had just successfully killed a towering monster, and I was like, well, I guess they're going to go to Barovia, and I don't know if it's going to really make really matter to them, because they've just done this. Their first session in Barovia, they go and explore a bit, and then they experienced zombies. They fought a group of zombies. Their first combat encounter in Barovia resulted in 2 player character deaths. And that was something really cool, because it changed what death meant. The players were able to see that not only was this world dangerous and really, really something that they had to pay attention to, but it was completely where their powers felt almost insignificant, where you could fell a giant in another world, a Cyclops, a child of the gods, could be destroyed by your hand. And now you come to this world, and shambling corpses infused with the power of a dark lord of the shadows, Strahd von Zarovich. This world has torn you all apart, And now you have to face the fact that 2 characters have died. What are you going to do? Yeah, I looked at that moment as like, okay, 2 players are dead. And it was one of those moments where I was like, okay, that's a lot. But I also knew the adventure. And this is something important to know if you're doing pre-writtens or if you're doing homebrew. You should ask yourself this next question. Do I have the facilities in my game to allow death to not be the final end? Meaning, if my players do face death, can they circum it? Can they overcome it? Curse of Strahd, I will let you know, they could. And they did, and it was very fun. But you have to ask yourself, what does that mean? What are the consequences of this? For many people with Dungeons and Dragons, it is usually an expense because you can go to a temple and get resurrection scrolls or resurrection spells can happen and you can be healed, and that's fine. And you move on from it and then continue with the adventure. You just have to pay a lot of gold and then that's kind of it, which makes sense. That's how it's been done since the first edition of D&D. I know I've played games from first edition D&D when that happened. But with certain games, that can feel lesser. Basically, resurrections and special magic that can bring people back to the dead, it can make you feel as if then nothing matters at that point. And we just need to start adventuring and getting a treasure hoard and just keep going to the temple. Once you do that, then death doesn't really mean anything at that point. But really, what you should be doing is asking yourself, well, when they are resurrected, what happens? Or what is the means of the resurrection? Who is doing the resurrection? In Curse of Strahd's instance, it was a corrupted being who has the power to raise the dead, and he will only do it if he is incentivized by the players for them to go and do something for him. In other circumstances, maybe it is just that the player's soul is tethered to something else. Maybe there is an issue with it, and maybe they need to go on a great adventure. Maybe the player is going to be, dies, and then their soul goes into the abyss for some reason, and then the resurrection happens and they pull through a demon with them. This is kind of the cool thing about when it comes to the process of how do you bring somebody back from the dead, if that is something that you actually want to have happen. What are the creative ways that you can make it so that there's consequences by that standard, or making it interesting or intriguing? If a player is like a fighter and they are constantly warring with other players, do they go to a plane of existence in which there is constant war happening and they come back, and when their soul comes back, they are in the midst of a battle, and the first thing that they do is make a swing on the priest that resurrected them? Maybe that happens, and maybe that's kind of something to be afraid of. That is a really great tool for you as a storyteller to start really thinking about your world and start thinking about what is possible and how you can maybe improve on these circumstances, and how can this moment, again, not be the end of the story for this particular character. Because another thing needs to happen. You need to talk to your player about death. You need to ask them, hey friend, hey fellow traveler, are you okay with this? Are you okay with death? Is this something that you want to happen? Is this something that you want to allow to have happened to you? Or do you want to move past this in some way and explore something else? An interesting thing about resurrection scrolls and resurrection spells in general with Dungeons and Dragons, they only work if the soul of the character that it's being worked on is willing to come back. It's a kind of a question that comes up not on the side of the dungeon master, but on the side of the player, where the dungeon master has to ask the player, do you want this character to come back? What do you need in order to come back as well? What are the necessities that you require and need? And can your dungeon master meet those needs? That's something that is a conversation that comes between the people, because tabletop role-playing games, as far as I believe them to be, are a collaborative medium of storytelling. And being a professional actor and improviser, I can tell you, Tabletop role-playing games are still my ideal form of storytelling. I love this medium, and I love the inspiring moments that come through when players and dungeon masters talk with one another. That's the most exciting thing. Sometimes my campaigns don't even start because I'm talking with the players the whole time. And talking about death is a very important conversation to have happen. So when this conversation has to happen because a circumstance is coming through, then maybe I think that the player should actually be able to say, hey, so this is what I'm feeling because of this event. It was a lot for me to deal with. It was hard for me to take on this death, or it made me feel a certain way. And I want to talk about maybe if we can bring this character back, like I'd love them to be resurrected as a possibility, maybe making that an actual mission for the players. Or maybe I don't want this character to come back, but I still want to be part of the game, and I want it to mean something so I can bring in a new character with a new perspective. Or maybe that conversation doesn't happen, and maybe the player just doesn't want to be part of the game anymore. Death is a moment of a lot of things. It is a moment to mourn. It is a moment to feel loss. We are allowed to feel loss and feel the suckiness of that loss. We are allowed to also reflect on the choices that we've made, but reflect on what has brought us to this moment. Unlike real life death, tabletop role-playing death allows for reflection of everybody, for players and for storytellers. We look at the moment and we get to say, hey, what has happened here? What do we get to do? And advice for this moment I would share is just basically being able to say, hey, what are we feeling in this moment? Checking in with people during moments of death is very good. Asking them genuinely, hey, how are you guys feeling after this? Certain situations can also provide, I would say, difficult circumstances for death. And they don't, the way to handle it is not publicly, but privately. I'll give an example. I love this man to death so much. One of my old players for the FSF campaign, he had a character who was a Warforged Eldritch Knight, and he was having trouble with his character. He didn't want to play the character anymore. He wanted them to just kind of go away, and he didn't want to engage anymore with it. So he said he wanted the character to die in sacrifice himself, committing suicidal rites and everything like that, but he wanted to die. And I said, well, let's actually figure this out. We can talk about it, and during the session, if we're seeing that kind of comes through, then we can actually allow for this process to actually be something of a meaningful, heroic send-off for the character. We can give you a heroic sacrifice moment. You can give the player an opportunity to make this ultimate death that they have going on something where they're looking forward to it, and you can have ownership of it, and being this guiding hand, because death is unpredictable, and when a player brings you a very unpredictable situation of, I want to kill myself, you go, oh, well, let me try to help you. In this particular instance, my player didn't do that. They didn't listen to my parameters or the things that I kind of had set up, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I was trying to set boundaries for what I needed for someone before they do a sacrificing moment, and it was messy. And the circumstance ended up with the player actually asking a player at the table, without that player knowing what the intention was, to have them send their magic to hurt them. And this was all during a combat encounter, so the player missed the attack, and then the player who sent the magic went down. The best way I can usually give the analogy of what we do in tabletop role-playing games is the idea of making a car. And a car in which every single player is behind a seat with a wheel at it. The Dungeon Master makes this car where there's wheels and brakes and accelerators, and we're all working together to drive this car. And moments of disharmony happen within the car that really send it flying. And this was one of those moments. And it was a moment where I, as the Dungeon Master, had to recognize, and where the players also had to recognize, that death was going to happen whether we wanted it to or not with this player. They wanted it to happen, and we couldn't fix it. It wasn't even something to fix. It wasn't even that it was a problem. Again, taking the negative connotation out of it, just being able to say, this is what a player wants, and we have to accept that. And we chose to accept it, but I chose to accept it on my terms. And I turned this moment that had turned into a very aggressive and fragile deconstruction of our entire gaming experience, and what ultimately could have ended the campaign there because it was so shocking and not a lot of people were okay with it. It made my safe space not safe. That was a moment in which the players sat and listened to me as I described the sending off of a friend who had reached the end of his journey and was ready to leave and was ready to be sent off and needed the help of his friends to do so. That's why he sent off and asked for the magic to be sent off in the first place, because he couldn't do it himself. And we turned this moment into a moment where people were crying, and I got emotional, and I get emotional talking about it. Because what we needed in that moment of death was not for it to be a sign or this awful consequence of someone trying to kill themselves. What we needed in that moment was a celebration of life and a celebration of where we had all come from. And it changed the moment from being this thing of tension and fear and unpredictability and something beautiful. And I talk about check-ins because after that moment, I checked in with all my players and they were not happy with it. Not everybody was okay with it. They were very upset, and they felt like that was an instant when death felt like it was a very limiting possibility, and it felt like choices didn't matter, that their choices and the story was insignificant. That's what they felt. It's kind of one of those moments that made me realize that when Dungeon Masters say that I play my games on hard mode, or I want this to be a game that is about violence and that death is the ultimate consequence and people need to take it seriously, this was a moment when death made this very unserious. It made it goofy. It took the severity and the honest emotions that come from death and cheapened it, because it was a moment when a player wasn't really considering the needs and the cares of everybody else. Checking in with players and asking them how they feel about this is very important. And when it comes to heroic sacrifice moments as well, this is also a moment when a player does have responsibility too. And heroic sacrifices, when done right, can be beautiful. They can mean so much, and they can be moving and bring us all to moving places. There can also be moments that shock us and make us scared. And we need to be there for each other. What do you need to do in a moment when death hits your table? How do you handle a player character death? Be there for your player. Be there for your players. Be there for everybody. Be there for each other. Being a dungeon master or being a player, when you are in this table, as far as I see it, you're coming here for novice DMing advice. This is the most novice advice I can give you. When you are a part of a tabletop role-playing game space, you're not playing a game, you're part of a community experience. And death is one of the hardest things that you can go through as a community. It's hard, it's sad, it sucks. But there's love there. And you find love with the people that you care about when you are in those places. That's what you need to do. You need to be there for each other. You need to support each other. And so what do you do next? Let's say a player dies because of fate, dumb dice, or maybe dumb decisions. Do you help the player in that process? Do you help them grow this new character? Do you help them in this means of actually talking about what is possible with your character? Again, have you set the standard that this can actually be resolved? Do you have an afterlife in your world? Can they go to the priests? Have you talked to your players about what they can do? Is it possible? What do you do and how do you engage in this process? It's again, how hands-on are you as a dungeon master? As a community leader, as a member of this table, do you care enough to help people through this process? Do you want to put yourself through this process again? Because again, tabletop role-playing games are an investment. You're talking to somebody who has an entire library of books and a bunch of different dice and miniatures. I've invested quite a bit of my time in this. So I care about it quite a bit. And when a character of mine dies, I care to make it right. And you have to ask yourself, do you? What is the investment that you have? Do you have an investment? Was it just a casual curiosity, or are you wanting to go further with it? If the answer is yes, I want to go further with it, well then what are the things you want to talk about? And this is a moment when, with handling death, you get to find out what people are excited about, what they want to explore next, what they want to do next, what we all want to begin to tap into on our next crazy adventure. And for Dungeon Masters, you get to kind of create the new scenarios there. You get to think about, well, what happens next? We've already touched on death with this character. What is it going to mean, and how's it going to explore that way? I will also say, Dungeon Masters, sometimes we don't want character death. Sometimes we don't want it. This game is a game, ultimately, and death does not have to be the end result. And I'm not talking about the idea of resurrection. I'm talking about that when a character goes to 0 hit points, you can break the rules. This is a situation in which I look at a circumstance and I say, well, maybe I don't want this character to die because I have put a lot of effort into a campaign. When I can see investment, when I can see that players are really invested in their characters and are invested in the story and like what they are doing, and they don't want it to end, and I don't want it to end, because I'm feeling that mutual exchange of investment and desire, then what I do is I say, okay, you've hit 0 hit points. I'm gonna let you know that what has happened is gonna have a consequence and it's gonna feel real to you. And I want you to feel that moment in your character. What I like to do is I like to understand my system. Look at the system that you play. What is something that you could do in the game that could make this feel like a significant story moment, can still keep the consequences of death and make them remind themselves like, hey, you remember how you died or almost did die? Remember that? Yeah, you're going to remember that through certain mechanics of the game. And what are the mechanics I can play with that will make the character have a sense of interest and love for what they're doing? It's a lot of trial and error. For example, my one friend Sunny in our Tomb of Annihilation campaign, she had a 250-something-year-old grandma who was a gnome who I crippled. I had an Allosaurus bite onto their spine, and their armor collapsed in on themselves, and they were tossed into the jungle, and they were paralyzed. Well, near paralyzing. It wasn't good. But the players were able to expend resources to help save this person, and in doing so, they were able to help pull her away from the void that exists in the adventure of Tomb of Annihilation. I stayed true to that. I even gave my player Sunny a moment to see into the void, and I let it still be real. And it was a question. What was that void? What was it? When she was pulled back, she also aged about 200 years. She looks 500 years old now as a gnome. And essentially, she now has a mechanic where she's at 15 feet of movement because her spine was broken. She has to move slowly in order to move. And that's it. That's all it is. But it remains a scar on her character. And not like a cosmetic scar, but one that has mechanical significance. She got in the way of an Allosaurus that was going to kill one of the other party members. And she got in the way to save their life. And I tell you this now, that did save their life. And the reason it saved their life was because Sunny was a player of mine that I saw really invest and have love for their character in every session. And I didn't want them to die. I wanted them to survive, but I also wanted them to feel the consequences of this. And so we made up that situation. And that was important to remember. It was important to remember because I saw that Sunny loved her character and loved playing them. And I wanted them to keep playing them. That communication with dungeon masters and players is also important. You have to ask yourself, does your player really connect with their character? And getting that. With an example to another character that is happening in the same campaign with a friend of mine, Jonathan, he's playing a Kenku who was blinded after he tried to numb a giant with some like drugs, and then the giant survived that and hit them in the face with an axe and in one shot dropped them to 0. That situation resulted in Jonathan's character becoming blind. As a monk, however, who's also a doctor, they started to kind of do the daredevil thing of being able to see people all around. However, Jonathan, I also acknowledge, doesn't like this. He doesn't like having a blind bird who has to expend resources to allow themselves to see more, even though they have blind sense. This is a situation that you realize what players like. And so what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to retcon it. Not retcon it, I'm going to still let it sit within the game, but I'm going to correct my choice through other means of what the players are introducing to me. Because again, it's a fantasy world. You can get creative. The result that you have played, if a player doesn't like it, you don't have to stick with it. Because what, at the end of the day, matters more than consequences, than the severity of choices, than death itself, is having a good time. I think it's important also not to judge people when death is not something that they want to face. It's okay to say you don't want to have to face it. It's okay to say that you don't want to have that happen. I will say personally, if death is not something that could happen in a scenario, I personally disconnect a little bit. I disconnect from the universality that is human survival, mortal survival. We have to survive on a daily basis, and I disconnect when I lose that tether to death. Mainly because it's not because I don't think someone takes it seriously, it's because I can see someone's fear of death has mainly surpassed their ability to understand how to handle it. It's kind of an understanding that if somebody's not gonna make me feel that like that tension or that closeness, I feel a disconnect. And I feel as if someone is just going to try to continue to tell their story, but I'm also not a part of it. It's like you want me to hit certain events, but you don't want me to feel like they matter. You know? It's kind of abstract that way, and it's kind of where I recognize that this conversation changes a little bit into being about the responsibility of making a game like have stakes and not have stakes. And I have also talked about how death doesn't have to be the only stake you have involved. You can present consequences to situations that don't involve death. And honestly, that's because I don't view death as a consequence. I view death as an exhilarating part of adventuring. I find it to be exciting. That's another reason why I say don't stress, don't be sorry, don't be scared of death. I'm excited to face it. I am personally. I'm also not playing at your table, and that's why you have to talk to the rest of the players. But that's the thing. Is it something that people are excited to face, or is it not? And is the Dungeon Master excited to have to deal with it, or are they not? Why aren't they? These are wonderful conversations to have, and we get to know more about our community in general. That's what we do. You don't have to be a novice to know that. Death isn't a situation where it is a consequence. It's not something where people need to feel, oh, this is a serious game for serious people. Death should be an exhilarating experience into what can happen next. You may have listened to the FSF campaign moment where I had my players literally say, we're going to kill ourselves at this moment to go into the abyss. That was the campaign. When one person's death, a suicide moment that happened with the Warforged Eldritch Knight was so hard and people checked in, it's like, we don't feel this means something. Oh gosh, I'm getting caught up in this. To later having a total party kill that everybody else had committed to, where the players killed themselves and went to different, like, extraplanar worlds to collect their souls, to meet the beings that were in charge of their afterlife, and then reconnect and then go into the Feywild to fight a shadow war. Death is an exhilarating and awesome storytelling tool for role-playing games, and it can be inspiring, and it only gets that way if the players inspire you to create beyond it. I think that if we treat it as a consequence and as a punishment, we're going in the wrong direction. I think that what we need to do is remember what it is. It is a device used in storytelling. It is something to let us know about the severity of actions, but even with player characters, it's not exclusive. Death happens to NPC characters all the time. I've experienced more NPC deaths all the time. Not every NPC death deserves the grand final scene. And if you want to give players a final scene, you're welcome to it. Hell, that's one of the easiest bits of advice. I should have opened with that. What happens when a player character dies? Give them a final scene. Let them talk. God, I can talk for a long time. This is wild. TLDR. Always remember your community. Stay with them. Share with them. They're the thing that makes it great. They're the thing that makes this game beautiful. Handle death together. At least that's what I think. I love to know what you guys think as well. And I look forward to one day talking about this subject again and talking about it at length with other people. Gosh, this is one of my favorite things to talk about with everybody. And I hope that you found some really good advice here. I hope that this inspired you and gets you creating and helps you getting some more scenarios. I would love to hear in the comments actually about how other people would handle death. Like, what are some alternatives to death that you would introduce? We don't always have to cripple gnome grandmas. We don't always have to blind Kenku monks. We can do other things. I'd love to hear about it. I'd love to hear about how you guys make this story and make death meaningful to you. And if you guys have really great positive experiences that you have with your own tables, share that with me as well. I'd love to hear it. Take care, everybody, and we'll see you again behind the screen very soon.